Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our webinar series. Today, we are lucky enough to have the great and wonderful Brian Keating from Great Big Nature with us. Um, Today's webinar, or the webinar series is we're powered by Site. Thanks you to Site for making these all possible. And today's webinar is sponsored by the Drozdowski family. Thank you, Bonnie, and my families that made this possible. So we appreciate that. So Brian's going to give us a couple stories. He's going to do a couple local stories because I think we're all going to be stuck here locally. So I got a couple slides here that I put together. Just from just some archived photos I found from Brian being a goof. I believe this was in the Galapagos. Just coming out of the water and evolving into a human. Brian practicing safety first while I'm moving bus and thinking keto. Brian getting close and up personal with nature like he always does. Brian with one of his many travel groups. Best group ever, right, Brian?
They were the best.
Yeah. And Brian's always been a mainstay at our events, and his African tribe family came to spend some time with him at one of our REMTechs.
A bunch of very nice primates, I must say.
So here's some contact info for Brian. There's the Great Big Nature series at greatbignature.com. Going Wild, his personal page, and you can find Great Big Nature on Facebook as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Brian, let Brian do his presentation, and then we'll come back and do questions. And have fun, Brian. Entertain us. No pressure. You got to entertain us.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Joe. This is a wonderful privilege to be involved with this. And you know, of course, most people hear about my trips abroad to different locations around the world. But I thought, since we're all trapped at home in discussion with Joe, I thought it would be a good idea to take us to Alberta and celebrate what we have here, because this is an amazing part of the world. Of all the travel I've done, whenever I'm coming back into Alberta, this is the place that I so enjoy coming back to. It's Alberta's an amazing province. We've got a lot going on. And I thought what I would do is look at two different areas. One is a river trip and another is a mountain trip. But I want to talk specifically first about the South Saskatchewan River. I've been canoeing since I was, I've been in high school. In fact, my wedding gift from my brothers was a homemade canoe, which I still use. And we do multi-day trips on Alberta rivers, and they're not high energy rivers. Our objective is to get out and enjoy what we've got going on around us in waters that take us into ribbons of wilderness areas. I think that's what rivers really are. They are landscapes that transect through a fairly built up rural population or rural agricultural society, but it gives us a bit of an opportunity to be in what feels like endless wilderness because of the coulee environment, the slopes, and the drainages that enter on these different rivers. So I've canoed pretty well every river south of from Red Deer south all the way to the United States border, all the way to the Saskatchewan border. Over the years, I've done many of these sections just as weekend trips and several week-long trips. Of course, the most important thing I own are my binoculars. Cameras are important because it's fun to record these events, but binoculars let you see the glint in the eye of the deer or the beaver or the sandpiper that you're watching when you're floating along. So let's go to the South Saskatchewan River first, and I want to take you into an area north of Medicine Hat. That little red dot in the bottom of the image is Medicine Hat, and we put in at a park Police Point Park there, and we started following those meanders north. And you can see where the green dots are. Those are agricultural pivot points where fields are irrigated with water. And then that last green dot, from there onward, I would call it a ribbon of Alberta shortgrass prairie wilderness. It's absolutely fantastic. And where the river turns to the right, about 3/4 of the way up the screen, that's all protected area from the Suffield military zone. So you need to get permission to go through that area before you embark on this trip. Here's a simpler map that shows you right pretty well in the very center. It shows a couple of green square areas. That was part of Alberta's protected landscape when Alberta was putting aside some of these beautiful remote areas for their ecological significance. And I'm going to show you some pictures of that. So memorize that green location. There's two of them, two green spots. And that essentially is an area of tremendous landscape relief, lots of hoodoos and bentonite coulees. So it's quite exciting in that part of the world. Now, for some reason, my screen is not moving forward, so I'm going to escape. Joe, I need your help. It's not, for some reason, it's frozen up.
Uh-oh.
It's very odd that this is happening. Okay.
Bear with us.
Yeah, my computer is not responding at all. Well, we try to figure this out. I'll just let you know that this was an 8-day trip from Medicine Hat North. You can do the trip in 5 days. We actually rented a car in Medicine Hat, and because it was just my wife and I on this trip, and we wanted to
Is your computer frozen? Sorry, is your computer frozen or?
It might be. Should I?
Reboot. Oh no, we'll lose your connection. Yeah, reboot and join us if you have to.
Okay, well, pretend, everybody watching this, pretend you're in somebody's personal slideshow in their living room and the projector bulb just blew. So refill your coffee or grab another treat from the fridge and I'll be right back.
Brian?
Okay, there we are. Joe, are you there?
Yeah, as they shut it, okay. Sorry, everyone, just give us a second. We'll be right back. Good old technology. Just so everyone knows, if you have questions during the presentation, you can type them in the question box and we'll get to them at the end of Brian's presentation and we'll go from there. Hopefully he's back online shortly. It all worked yesterday when we tried it, so just bear with us.
Okay, Joe, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good.
Okay, just a second. I'm going to swap back to you.
Okay. I'll launch my slideshow again.
You have control again.
Okay, here we go. I'm just going to launch the slideshow. Okay, good. And there's the area that I wanted to focus on, because the only way to get there is by canoeing to this location. So it's about a 4-day trip to get there north of Medicine Hat by canoe. We did see a couple of fishermen parked alongside the river on this trip, but they had obviously gotten permission from landholders to drive in on very just very basic dirt roads. So here we are on the start of the trip, and there's our fully loaded boat. This is after we had done the canoe shuffle. We had left our truck at the end point, right on the Saskatchewan border, right on the Trans-Canada Highway. There's a park up there, right next to the river. And so there's our fully loaded canoe, ready for an 8-day adventure on the South Saskatchewan River. Now, we left at the time of the year when the river was at its highest, and in fact, we missed it by about 3 or 4 days. The trick is to get as much water flowing down the South Saskatchewan River to allow you to be carried without too much work to your end point. The idea is to enjoy the canoe trip, not necessarily work hard. Well, we were about 5 or 6 hours into our first day of canoeing, and I looked behind me and saw this black amoeba-like cloud coming in, and this was our first big adventure of the day. It was a serious storm. We immediately pulled off to the side of the river, disgorged all of our gear out of the boat because the wind was now starting to bear down on us. We managed to pull all of our gear out. We turned the boat over, secured it to a tree with a rope, and then we hid under a tarp, and all hell broke loose. The hail was flying. The storm lasted about an hour. We felt like a couple of gophers hiding in our hole. When the moment came to finally peer over the tarp, there was blue sky on the western horizon, and we paddled to another point and set up our tent and overnighted. And the joy of prairie in the spring is that the landscape is alive with birds. Every morning we were greeted by meadowlarks and various other species of birds. This is a pipit nest that we found in the prairies as we were hiking. We camped in paradise every night, finding locations like this. We never built a fire because we knew that if there was ever an issue with the fire catching the grassland on fire, it would be a tragic occurrence. So we camped and just used our camp stove to do our cooking. We brought all our own water with us because, of course, the South Saskatchewan River in flood is like chocolate milk flowing. The water is certainly no good to drink. And we found these old forest campsites, cottonwood trees, often with great horned owls nesting in them, or kestrels, and we just absolutely relished the chance to be able to wild camp. When we finally went through the military Suffield Reserve, there was a pinnacle rock called Martin's Rock that we knew to look for, and that's that pinnacle of bentonite in the middle of the screen there. And we knew that we were coming into that very exciting badland and hoodoo landscape. All along the way, I was in touch with CBC Edmonton and Calgary. I did my radio show using my radio satellite telephone, and also did an interview with the Herald talking about the value of our Alberta backyard rivers. We've got a number of fabulous rivers that flow through this province. We're very blessed having our mountain landscape to the west, which provides us with the water that keeps these rivers fed all summer long. And here we are coming closer to Martin's Rock, and you can see the height of the land. It's 200 or 300 meters of elevation gain. We climbed to the height of land every evening just to take in the views around, and of course enjoyed our camping. It was fantastic. We would use our tarp for a dual purpose. One would be for rain if we encountered situations where the rain was about to happen or could possibly happen or was happening. But otherwise, we used it as a ground sheet to keep our camping and cooking area clean. And here's a broad view, a panorama view of our camp. We had a couple of camps where we stayed 2 nights in a row, so we didn't have to move the camp each day, especially in the more complicated terrain where there was good coulees to hike up and explore. And this is the kind of landscape we had. There was always a house wren calling from the trees. There was various types of other birds, various species of sparrows, and it kept us entertained entirely. And this is one of those evenings where we set up and the sky was looking seriously bad, dangerous, with more rain coming. So we camped happily with these big tarps, which kept us dry when the weather got inclement. Of course, in the springtime, when there's been enough moisture, the cactus bloom. This is mammillaria. It's the small cushion cactus that grows right on the ground. And we also saw the prickly pear cactus in full bloom, the joy of paddling in late June. We found some interesting bones along the way. This is from a beaver. You can see the size of its front tooth. They constantly obviously have to chew to keep those teeth worn down. We saw a number of beaver. In fact, we saw 7 species of mammals during our paddle through this wilderness area. The beaver was one of the ones that we saw every day, several times a day, slapping their tail, usually to let other beavers know that this weird canoe was coming down on them. Every day we went hiking. That was the objective. The objective of doing all these trips is to go exploring in these coulees. And I'm looking at something that was, well, it's the first time I'd ever found something like this. It was a brand new little mule deer, and it was dead. Who knows why or how? Mom was nowhere near. The baby looked relatively fresh. I mean, it had died probably just during the night. Not a clue as to why it died. Later on, we saw a turkey vulture fly over, so I don't think the carcass went to waste. Nature isn't always, always has its systems in place to deal with these situations. And when I mentioned hoodoos, of course, we've all been to the Badlands, and the Badlands are some of my favorite landscapes. But this particular hoodoo landscape is one that would be very seldom visited by anybody, only by the odd canoeist that goes through on this canoe trail. And some of them were amazing. And the cliffs, of course, alongside the river harbor some interesting bird life. And if you see right in the center of the picture, just above center, there's a prairie falcon there. This prairie falcon had 5 chicks on the nest. We saw 5 different prairie falcon nests during our canoeing, and it was always exciting to come across them. Here's a picture from my guidebook. It shows the prairie falcon, the underside of the wing there. You can see it's got that black under armpit, and that's what makes them easily distinguished from a peregrine or a merlin.
Hey, Brian.
Yes.
Can you move your cursor off their screen?
Oh, I can't even see my cursor.
It's gone now.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So here we are climbing up. There's my wife climbing up one of the steep coulees in this protected area. And you can see the sagebrush, the large chunks of sandstone, and the bentonite, the way it erodes vertically, creating opportunities for hoodoos to form with that thicker and denser layer of bedrock, giving a chance for birds to nest under. We came across cliff swallow nests and bank swallow nests and others. And then we came across this bird. It's a nighthawk. And it's actually standing or sitting on a very, very old, highly decayed antler from a mule deer. And as we were walking up that slope that I just showed that picture prior to this one of my wife climbing, we almost scared this up off its little roost. It stayed there, fully believing in its camouflage, giving us a chance to photograph. This is one of my favorite prairie birds, and we heard them the entire way on this trip. The nighthawk gives that kind of a meow, meow call, especially in the evening. And they've got a very broad mouth behind that little tiny beak that you can see there, and they feed on insects. They're not related to owls, but they are nocturnal, but most active right at dusk. And they do this occasional call or this sound where they do a dive. When the males are proclaiming territory or trying to attract a mate, they'll fly up, 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 and then does a nose dive straight down. And you can hear, if you're watching with your binoculars, you can actually see when they pull out of that steep dive, it looks like they're going to go drive themselves right into the ground. When they pull out, you can hear them go, and apparently the chicks loved. That's their method of attracting a mate. These coulees, some of them went on extensively for several kilometers, and so this is why we camped in this region of those 2 green spots that I showed you earlier on that map, so that we could explore these coulees high up. And we came across some other wildlife. This is a Nuttall's cottontail. It's one of our classic native species of hares and or rabbits, and it's we only saw a couple of them. They're not very common. At least some years I'm sure they're more common than others. They would typically rise in numbers and then crash over a certain period of time. But this guy allowed fairly close approach. And if you remember hares, the difference between hares and rabbits, hares have hair on them when they're born, and they're active only very quickly after they're born, whereas rabbits are born naked and blind, and they need a lot of parental care before they can hop out and start feeding on their own. But these were some of the views that we had, and it was so spectacular. Every evening we would walk up to the height of land to watch the sunset and just listen to the end of the day. Listen to the birds calling, the sprague's pipits flying high, calling above, and the occasional great horned owl hooting. We would watch the nighthawks doing their dive bombing from up here. Prairie falcons occasionally flying by. We came across a number of teepee rings from the First Nations people that at one time lived here and thrived here. We came across some grave sites and hardly any indication of human settlement here other than the First Nations. There were no roads that we came across. We would scan the horizon with our binoculars and occasionally see a house way on the horizon, but otherwise no indication. What a pleasure it is that we live in a place where we can socially distance ourselves from the large populations of human beings by hopping into a river and being transported on this magic liquid carpet into these beautiful wilderness areas. We came across all kinds of species of flowers. This is the milkweed. It's got a very flamboyant flower. It was always full of interesting insects. You can see a small stink bug in the lower part of the frame there. And of course, this is what the monarch butterfly is after when they're in our part of the world. This is another species of flower, and it's got a very interesting green insect on it. That's actually a native species of bee. There are about 200 species of native bees in Alberta. They're critical to the pollination of our native plants, and they're bees that we basically don't pay much attention to because we're all focused on the honeybee, which is actually an introduced European species. It's not a native species to Canada at all. These are our native bees, and north of the Mexican border, over 400 species of them, and in Canada, I believe, if I remember right, about 200 species. And all of these insects seem to have little surprises when we looked closely in these flowers. And their geology, of course, is forever fascinating. Sandstone, the way it erodes, very interesting, almost Swiss cheese-like appearance. And some of the hoodoos, so tiny and yet so perfect in size. I didn't touch this one. I was just showing that it was balancing on a very, very tenuous little podium here. Fascinating the way hoodoos form, and they create an interesting feature in the landscape. I uplifted one little rock at one point and found Alberta's only scorpion species. It immediately looked up at me and put out its little pinchers and basically said, "Go ahead, make my day." But it's interesting to know that we do have scorpions in Alberta. They are not common at all, but I was lucky to find this guy. And where else would you find it but in southern Alberta, which has, what is it, about 14 inches of precipitation a year. So a very dry landscape, semi-arid for sure. Now I'm squatting here beside an exciting find. All of those broken bits that you see in the foreground are all dinosaur bones. So it was one large or several large dinosaur bones here that have fragmented and broken up over time. You can see some larger bones on the lower right, and there's an example of those bones there. You can't pick them up, you can't take them home, you're not allowed to do that anyway. And if you did, they would break up into 1,000 pieces. But how exciting it is to get into a landscape like this and find dinosaur bones in abundance. Here's a beautiful big dinosaur bone here. You can see how it's fragmented in many locations, many breaks along it. These are dinosaur bones that are weathering out of the bentonite after heavy rains. And in the springtime, new ones are being revealed every year. And it's exciting to be in environments like that to see that. And then the last evening, we could tell by our GPS that we were only about 5 hours away from our takeout point. So just before we got to the highway next to the Saskatchewan border, we had one last night, a beautiful night. We had catbirds calling to us from those bushes, and spotted sandpipers voicing their presence on the river. There was beavers moving up and down. We saw mule deer. We saw the occasional pronghorned antelope. And of course, the area is famous for its large numbers of elk, and we saw several. As we went, we saw a golden eagle actually at one point pick up a young Canada goose, and we watched it with our binoculars. The goose was too much to carry for the eagle. It ended up dropping it, and the goose had to circle around and come back in. So seeing those little nature vignettes makes trips like this and makes them memorable, and they're available to all of us. They're in our Canadian backyard, and what a pleasure. So that's the first of the two stories that I want to show you. Joe, do we have time for the second?
Of course we do. Lots of time.
Okay, good. I want to take you on one of my favorite adventures. You know, since I was in high school, I started mountaineering, and it's been one of my pastimes. I call this show Alpine High Life, and it's a bit of a personal show. Of course, in Alberta, we have our prairies, which are to be cherished. And in the springtime, right now is the time to go and visit some of these locations. The birds are just arriving now. Of course, the mountains are still locked in snow, but as the spring progresses, that snow will disappear quickly, and then the high country is open for all of us. And so I want to celebrate our own Alberta backyard. And this is that fellow that you see on the right-hand side of the screen there in the light colored jacket. That's me in high school. And this was the very first mountain that I climbed in our own Rocky Mountains. It took us a couple of days to get to the top of this mountain to hike in and then climb it. It was really a very easy mountain to climb. It's just that it was fairly remote. But it was that first moment when I realized how joyful it is to go up high in our Rockies. I got a job down in southern Saskatchewan or southern British Columbia, and this is the famous Kokanee Glacier in Kokanee Provincial Park. And my then girlfriend, now wife, and I climbed up to the glacier, and we got up there right at sunset. We set up our tent, and in the morning, I unzipped the tent, and this is what greeted us in the morning. And if some of you are getting thirsty right now and you don't know why, it's because that used to be the cover of the beer label for Kokanee Glacier. And so that is the actual summit of Kokanee Peak. And later on that day, my wife and I walked over across the glacier, and we climbed up that couloir that we see there and stood on the summit. We could look down and see the bright green bridge of Nelson town in British Columbia. And it was through these mountain hikes that I got to develop an appreciation for the botany that's up there. This is the seed head to Western anemone. This is the alpine crocus, and there are right now crocuses blooming all over the prairies. This is the mountain equivalent. It'll be coming up in a few weeks when the snow starts to leave the high country. And it's not just the joy and beauty of these of flowers or their seed heads, but they can give you a spiritual attraction too. A good friend of mine actually was losing all of his hair prematurely in his early 30s, and so he was a very talented photographer. He actually took a picture of himself and double exposed it into the middle of one of these flowers. And since then, he's always called this flower hippie on a stick. But it made him feel good about losing his hair. And you hike these high country areas, and it's the surprises like this that you come across. This is a ptarmigan on the nest. When I saw her, I nearly stepped on her. I kept walking past her, and then I took off my backpack and went back and took this picture of her sitting on the nest. She was so sure of her camouflage, she just stayed right there. And it's these types of stories that stay with you forever. These wildlife encounters, these unexpected jewels of the alpine landscape. And I have to tell you a little bit of a personal story here. Now, this is my wife, and this is my first date with her. When I was just courting her, I took her up into the mountains, up into the Kokanee Park. You can see on the plate beside us, there's some healthy cheese and some Triscuits. I backpacked in some cut crystal wine glasses. I put them into clean socks, and we brought in an Aunt Jemima bottle full of Emu cream sherry. We have since moved on to Harvey's Bristol, but this was in the good old days. I'm having a toast with her, trying to court her, trying to show her that I was worthy of her attention. And it obviously worked, because from then on, she followed me everywhere. And here we are climbing up one of the couloirs on a mountain in the Selkirk Mountains. And we have explored these areas together ever since. Now, this is down in a crevasse on Kokanee Glacier, and you can see the beautiful crystals of snow that have formed in this environment where the humidity would be just always fairly high because of the ice evaporating out the moisture in there. And it forms these gorgeous big crystals. But I just want you to focus on my then girlfriend, Dee. And she noticed, she knew that I was shooting with Kodachrome film. And look what she's wearing. In those days, Kodachrome film was sensitive to reds and blues. And look what she's wearing, a red bandana with red gloves and red leotards, and even the red shoelaces on her boots. And then the blue, of course, her shirt and her harness and her blue eyes. Now, why she paid any attention to me in those days is beyond me, because in those days I was strictly monochromatic. But our relationship flourished, and we have gone on to explore all kinds of areas together. We've climbed these big peaks, and we've camped on their summits. We've welcomed the dawn, the crack of dawn, with the sun coming early in the morning from these high locations. Even when the weather was not what most people would call good, we still went. We have a belief that we go no matter what the weather, and if it beats us back, then okay, that's okay. But here, this is on a fairly small mountain in the Front Ranges during inclement weather, but we got to the summit and it felt like we were in the Himalaya. It was absolutely beautiful. And after a day of rain, where else can you get a picture of this? An alpine flower with all of its parts studded in little droplets of water. It looked like they were covered in diamonds. And really, on a day like that, all you need is somebody to hold an umbrella, and that allows you to get those kinds of photographs. I remember one day squiggling around in the alpine meadow in my full rain suit. It was snowing big fat globules of snow, and the best, my most favorite shot of a ptarmigan was obtained that day. I have hundreds of photographs of ptarmigan, but to see this one enveloped in that environment is absolutely stunning. But there is nothing like the sun coming out in the morning. This is early morning sun, high in the alpine, illuminating the flowers of Arctic willow. And what a pleasure. And on those sunshiny days, it just makes your heart sing. And I guess one of the things that mountains have taught me is how small we are and how big they are. it puts everything into perspective in a sense. And this is in the Bugaboos. We camped up here on several different occasions. This was one of the first trips I did. We climbed up high, and we were going to stay in a mountain hut up there, but as soon as we walked in, there was all kinds of people there, and we thought, no, we got to socially distance ourselves. And so we went up another 1,000 vertical feet, and we set up our tent here. And believe it or not, this is an official campground. We call that tent our home sweet dome. And it's an official campground. And what makes it official is that there's a bathroom there. And I have to say, sitting on that bathroom, it's the best bathroom in the world. The view from the loo was unbelievable. And you sit there and your mind sails and your heart sings, and life doesn't get any better. But you don't need an official campground to find a loo with a view. This is on one of the high alpine passes somewhere in the Kananaskis. It's a place we've actually camped on several times. Nobody goes there. We've never seen any other people there. It's hard to get to, and it takes a lot of effort to get there, but the rewards are huge. There was a beautiful lake off to the left, but one of the times that we were there, just my wife and I were camped in our home sweet dome, and we heard some rocks falling. We looked up, and there were some goats coming down towards us. And then the goats appeared on the ledge just below. I stood up and took this photograph. And I'll never forget that. The goat looked at me, looked away, and then pounced off the rock and disappeared. And it gave me a feeling for, just such an attachment to these animals. It approached me out of curiosity. It continued to stay in the area with his buddies and graze. And it was such a treat to have a goat approach me rather than me approach it. And these are the slopes where you look for wildlife, bighorn sheep. This is a marmot in the Rocky Mountains, and I think he's probably one of the most photographed marmots around. He actually put some of his marmot nose snot on my lens. And wherever marmots are, there are Columbian ground squirrels. This is the alpine equivalent of our Richardson ground squirrel, our common gopher. And wherever these guys are, there should be grizzly bears. And we don't see very often the grizzly bear, but we do encounter their tracks. And here's some of their poop. It looks like a big Zorro red squirt. I can only imagine how happy that grizzly bear must have been feeding on all of those berries and then letting loose this particular bit of example of their poop. We had our tent set up, and as we were removing our tent, the snow, of course, had fallen during the night, and during the half hour it took us to pack up our tent, this grizzly bear had walked right beside us. We never even noticed it, but we found the tracks right there, and I guess that's the joy of snow. It lets you know who was there prior to you. And this is way up high on a mountain in Yoho National Park, and the grizzly had wandered over this the day before, leaving its tracks. Now, it's not only snow, snow is not only good just for watching and looking out for wildlife, but what a pleasure to go up high and then let gravity take you down. And of course, bum skiing, as my wife just showed, is one way to get down. Another is using the ice axe like this. But we're not the only ones that can have fun. We came across this location where a grizzly bear had repeatedly gone off the slope on the north side, the unmelted side of a ridge in Kananaskis one spring. And whenever we're in the mountains, we have to be aware of the fact that temperatures and climates can change. This is August 1st one year. We stayed in bed that morning and had a second cup of coffee and just enjoyed the towhead babies, those hippies on a stick covered with their little white snow cap. The birds, of course, adapt to these environments. The ptarmigan in the winter turns so white, and they double their feather mass to survive. And the way we survive in these mountains is by knowledge. You have to be careful when you get up into these areas, and a crevasse like that could snuff you out in a whisper. So it's important to take the appropriate courses before you do that. Here we are climbing Mount Assiniboine. I actually had my friend go back down the slope so I could picture him perfectly with Magog Lake behind. And actually, speaking of photography, it's important to know that for every mountain photographer does this. You can do it too. You don't have to tell anyone, but you can tilt your camera to make it look steeper than it really is. It wasn't that steep that day, but as long as there's no horizon in the background or no tree to give it away, tilt your camera, make it look good, and then show it off to your friends. Here's where I tilted the camera. We're down in a crevasse. I had my friend look up at the hole that he was at the top of the crevasse where he was climbing out of to make it look that much more dramatic. And here's climbing a big mountain in the Rocky Mountains. The ice axe, even if you don't know how to use it, make sure it's in every picture because it'll make you look like a mountain hero. Seriously, you should know how to use an ice axe. They can save your life, but they can also cause a great deal of damage to you if you don't use them right. But being up high on a slope like this, what a pleasure. It just makes you feel like you've got the world in the palm of your hands, and it reminds you of the joy of social distancing, of that last time that we went downhill skiing. Actually, I love downhill skiing, don't get me wrong. It's just nice to get out there on your own, and that's really what it's all about. And I think that that's what Alberta offers so well, is this idea to get out in nature and celebrate the color, celebrate the diversity, celebrate what we've got here. And at the end of the day, it's all just good fun. And Joe, those are my two programs for you. I thought celebrating nature, following our mountain or our streams would be good fun, and also celebrating nature in our own Rocky Mountain backyard would also be a nice way to celebrate today's webinar.
Thanks, Brian. That was great. And echo exactly. Getting out in nature does the mind and body great. Even the little pond in your neighborhood, just to go sit there in the evening and watch the birds and listen and take a break from everything we're going through, makes a big difference. For the little ones that are watching out there, tell us the importance of binoculars, because you do this whenever you present for us at schools around Alberta, and we bring you out to schools. Tell them why binoculars are so important.
When I got my first pair of binoculars, I was 12 years old, and I wish I still had them. They came from a secondhand store, but they basically showed me the way a falcon sees. When you look with binoculars, you can see the color of the animals that much better. You can see the expression of their faces. You can see, like I said, the glint in the eye of the robin on your front yard. I use my binoculars all the time. Whenever I go for a walk, I take them with me. Whenever I go to a rock concert, I take them with me. Whenever I go to a play, I take them with me. Having binoculars basically opens up the world, and it's I think the most important tool that I own.
Great. Okay, if you have questions, feel free to type them into the question box. I'll get to them as I can, and we'll use up as much of Brian's time as we can. He doesn't mind. I have here from Lorene, Brian. She says to say hi and sends hugs to you and Dee.
Hi, Lorene, that's great.
Kelsey's daughter would like to know if on your South Saskatchewan trip you ran into any rattlesnakes.
Yes, we did actually. Rattlesnakes are one of my favorite snakes because they are so unique and so perfectly designed. Yes, we came across rattlesnakes on a couple of occasions. They are, they're a snake to be respected for sure. I wouldn't ever be fearful of them unless I accidentally stepped on one, but they give you lots of warning. The reason why that rattle evolved was because rattlesnakes evolved in a landscape with about 60 million bison running around. And when you're only this far off the ground, your body's only that far off the ground, and you've got a herd of bison walking towards you, you need a way to let the bison know, so that rattles, that tail when they rattle is an alarming device that lets the bison know that they're about to receive a pretty painful blow if they keep walking in that direction. So rattlesnakes are unique creatures. Years ago, when I worked as a naturalist with the Canadian Wildlife Service, I actually had one that gave birth to 20 babies, and then I made sure the babies all ate a little pinky mouse before I released them back in their hibernaculum in the fall. Rattlesnakes are a critical part of our Alberta backyard, and the South Saskatchewan River is an excellent place to see them.
And did you run into pronghorns down there? Because that's their habitat down there, right?
It is their habitat. But remember, we were mostly in the river valley, and pronghorns like wide open prairie. So whenever we walked up to the height of land at the end of the day and then scanned with our binoculars, that was the time when we would have a chance of seeing pronghorn antelope. And we saw them on a couple of occasions. And a couple of times as we were paddling, we could see them up on the ridge, up on the edge, looking down at us. But they are an animal that is basically adapted to the wide open places. So the best place to see pronghorn antelope is down south of Medicine Hat near the Alberta-Saskatchewan border. I've seen good numbers down there pretty well every time I've been.
Okay. Karen would like to know, are there abundant camping spots for doing trips that don't cover lots of water each day on the South Saskatchewan there?
Yes, yes. I think my biggest trick that I would like to pass on is to bring a pair of rubber boots. And you'll need them every time you get out of the canoe because there's often real thick silt and mud that you have to negotiate to get your canoe pulled up onto the riverbank. And then, of course, you have to find good camping spots that have cover, trees, for instance, just to keep the sun off your tent. There's a lot of very, very good riparian forest along that bank. Even though it's shortgrass prairie at its best, there are certain areas where the riparian habitat has grown quite nicely. So there are good spots to camp. We never had an issue finding a spot. We were always very selective. So we would start looking usually at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We did 8 days instead of the 5 days that it takes to do the trip because we wanted to have extra time so we wouldn't have to paddle every day, all day. I think the more time you can spend on the river, the better, because it gives you more of an opportunity to paddle less, hike more, and enjoy the joy of our prairie backyard.
In the areas like closer to Medicine Hat, are there abundant access to roads to get onto the river, or is it long stretches without road? Or
yeah, there's really no place to put in unless you there's really no place to put in unless you put in Medicine Hat. There are ways of putting in. Years ago, probably 20 years ago, I did a portion of the South Saskatchewan River north of Medicine Hat. I looked up and got permission from one of the farmers that owned a ranch that abutted near a place called Five Finger Rapids. It's the only rapids on the river, but trust me, they're easy if you're at all competent in a canoe. They're easy. If you get nervous, then just get out and walk your canoe through the rapids. It's not that difficult. But that's where we put in the first time I went, and we got permission from a farmer. But remember, all of those roads are remote. Many of them will turn into gumbo after a rainstorm, so they're not gravel all-weather roads. And most of that is private property. So the easiest way is to do the whole route. You have to get permission from the military. And Joe, I can pass that information on to you if people would like to know how to do that. And there is a book on the South Saskatchewan River on how to canoe it, and it's put out by the Grasslands Naturalists. And I have the information on how to order that book that I could send you.
Okay, that'd be great. Craig's son would like to know, what is your most interesting trip that you've been on?
Oh my gosh, I would have to say that there are so many in Alberta. My gosh, the one that I guess it's the latest trip that I've been on is always the one that sits in my mind as the most exciting. I did a multi-day backpacking trip from Jasper into Banff last year, and that was very exciting. These multi-day canoe trips are always some of the best. I was just recently, just 2 months ago, just before the lockdown occurred, I was down in Chile, and I was in the Atacama Desert in northern Chile, exploring one of the driest places on planet Earth. It gets a fraction of a centimeter of rain a year. Can you imagine an area? It's called hyper arid. But we got up into the high country and explored some of the landscapes up there. And in my mind, that's one of the most recent trips I was on, so it's one of the best. But I've been exploring Africa for the last 30 years. I go every year, although this year I may not. We'll see what happens. I've got a trip planned for October, but we'll see how that pans out. In Alberta, I have to say, exploring our own mountains and exploring our own prairies are some of the best trips you can do.
On that vein, if there was a trip you could do again, not necessarily in Alberta, but anywhere in the world, which trip would you do again?
Oh my. You know, my heart sits in Africa because I've been bird watching since I was 12, and that means I've been getting out into nature since I was 12, and that means I like getting into really seriously rich nature areas. And some of the richest nature areas I've been to have been in Africa. A place called Manapools National Park in Zimbabwe is one of my all-time favorite locations. I was there just last year, and it's as good as it's always been, with good numbers of elephants and lion, and the bird life is over the top. It's got a fabulous riparian forest along the edge. So I think if I had one last trip to do, I would say I'd go back to Africa. But you know, don't let me downplay anything here in Alberta. Right now, the bird life is coming into this province. It's flowing in by the thousands. 2 days ago, just in my own backyard along the Bow River here, we had virtually dozens of yellow-rumped warblers, and that's just one example of one species that is coming in huge numbers. On the weekend, we also had Swainson's thrushes arrive in big numbers. They're on their way up to Edmonton and further north up into the boreal forest. And so right now, the month of May especially is one of the best months to be out there looking with your binoculars.
Chris Fisher mentioned, I think yesterday was the peak of bird migration into Alberta, with over 1 billion possible birds passing through Alberta. So now's the time to be out and exploring. Bonnie's son, Matthew, would like to know how many snakes you've seen, and did any come into your tent?
You know, I've never had a snake come into my tent because I like to zip my tent up every night. I have a tent that has a lot of mesh, so there's lots of airflow through it. And if it's not going to be a rainy night, or if there's no chance of rain, I leave the tent fly off completely so that I can see almost 360 degrees under the moonlight around my tent. I've never had a problem like that. I've seen racers in Alberta. I've seen lots of rattlesnakes, lots of garter snakes. There's not really a lot of snake diversity in this province. But in other parts of the world, I've come across all kinds of snakes. I've managed to photograph pythons in Africa and adders and all kinds of interesting snakes, and even cobras. I've been a snake enthusiast since I was a little boy. I used to build terrariums, and I always had a snake in my bedroom. And it's I think snakes are amazing, and I think they're underappreciated. I think snakes are one of the jewels of the reptile world, and I love them. I think they're fantastic. Rattlesnakes have always intrigued me. Any of the pit vipers have intrigued me. The way they hunt, they've got actually sensory devices in their face that allow them to follow small rodents in the pitch black. So their ability to sense their environment and to hunt is unbelievable.
Darcy's son, Kieran, would like to know, what other species of birds did you see in southern Alberta?
Oh boy, well, we saw 65 species on that trip. I just read my notes before I showed this slideshow tonight just to see, but we saw 65 species. So one of the highlights was a lazuli bunting. That is just one of the most amazing birds. Look it up in your bird book. Some people pronounce it lazuli. But I've always called it lazuli bunting. It's got a rainbow of colors, and that was the first time I had seen one in that part of southern Alberta before. So that was very exciting. We saw a number of different birds of prey. So we saw the harrier hawk, which used to be called the marsh hawk. We saw, of course, I already mentioned prairie falcon. We saw peregrine falcon. We saw golden eagle. We saw bald eagle. We watched a raccoon fishing for mollusks. As we sat on one side of the river, the raccoon was on the other. Now, raccoons have just come into Alberta in the last couple of decades, so that was interesting to see a raccoon at work. He didn't know we were there, and we watched him. We saw mule deer and white-tailed deer, and we saw elk. But the bird life was astounding. The rufous-sided towhee woke us up every morning and put us to bed every night. That's one of my all-time favorite birds. We saw a brown thrasher, which is another bird that I've been a big fan of since I started bird watching, because we had brown thrashers out east as well, and we find them in southern Alberta. The southern Alberta birds are very exciting, and lots of ducks, of course. We saw pelicans fly over. We saw them fishing on the river. We saw cormorants. We saw great blue herons. The list goes on and on.
And you mentioned you saw a vulture, which a lot of people didn't know we had vultures in Alberta, and they're back right now.
They are back right now. In fact, my wife was just looking at the Alberta Bird Alert, and she noticed there were 3 of them spotted in the southern part of Calgary. And a friend of mine, actually a bat researcher, Dr. Robert Barclay, emailed me yesterday. He saw a turkey vulture in North Calgary, and that was the first time he had ever seen one. Yeah, and Joe, I remember you photographed one on a barn.
Yeah, in central Alberta.
Yeah.
Have you canoed the Red Deer or Little Red Deer rivers? And if so, are there overnight runs that you would recommend for father-son trips?
Oh, so good. I've done a lot on the Red Deer River. I've never canoed the Little Red Deer River, but I've gone right from the town or the city of Red Deer all the way to Drumheller, and I've gone from Drumheller all the way down. So, the way to do it is to look at a map, and then you can put in where a bridge crosses, and then take out where another bridge crosses, and try not to make your trip too long, because I've done it too many times where we thought we could canoe further than we should, and then we're canoeing at 8 o'clock in the evening on the last day, trying to find our vehicle, trying to get out of the river. So make the trips shorter rather than longer, so you can take your time, so you don't have to spend the entire day in the river, and basically go from one river crossing to the next. And there's a whole bunch of wonderful trips. Start off small, just do one short trip first, and get an idea for how long it takes you to do that trip. Do it in the spring. Do it right now, because now is, from now until the middle of June, because now is when the river is rising. You could even go to the end of June. I did the South Saskatchewan River in September one year, and I ended up pulling the canoe a long ways. Or not the South Saskatchewan, but the Red Deer River, and I ended up pulling the canoe a long ways over mud flats. So don't do that. Go when the water's high. Watch the river, and there's a website that you can look up to see the cubic meter flow of the river. And once you start to understand what those numbers mean to your experience of canoeing the river at various times during the spring, you'll get a real feel for how it works. One of the best rivers I've canoed too is the Milk River in southern Alberta. But the best time to do that is before the long weekend in May and during the week, because it's becoming a very popular canoe trip.
If someone has some questions from some kids, pop them in the questions. We'll just go for a few more minutes here if Brian doesn't mind. What's the highest mountain you've ever climbed, Brian?
Mount Kilimanjaro, and I've done that twice. But I've done some other big ones in South America, and of course I've climbed Mount Assiniboine and a few others. I have not climbed Mount Robson. For my honeymoon, I flew around Mount Logan with my new wife, but I've never climbed it. We just took a bush plane and flew around it. But I've been climbing since high school, and you know, in those early years of climbing, Joe, the objective was to get to the summit. It took me at least a decade to learn that it was the trip going up that mattered, not necessarily the end point. So I think that was a level of maturity. In those early days, I took some pretty foolish chances that I look back on now and I shake my head. The joy is being out there, and the joy is going up high into those vistas to get those views.
I can't agree more. Tara's daughter would just like to say thank you. She loved the pictures of the fluffy ptarmigans. What is your favorite? This is from Fern, age 7, who wants to know what's your favorite photo from either of those 2 trips that you showed.
Yeah, boy, that's a hard question. I think one of the things that always surprises me is when I get down close and I look into flowers. And I think that one picture that I took of the flower, the purple flower with those 2 native bees in them. I love that picture, and I love that collection of colorful flowers. Flowers are a real celebration of life, and their importance to the insects that can be found can't be understated. So I think the flower pictures in my South Saskatchewan river trip are some of my favorites. They're the ones that always kind of surprise me every time I look at them. And the mountain trip, I have to think back to those early days of mountain exploration where I was learning how to climb mountains and how to safely cross glaciers and how to glissade. And that one picture of me holding onto my ice axe and glissading down the mountain, that was the peak. I didn't point it out, but that was Kokanee Peak in the background there. Kokanee Park and Kokanee Peak mean a lot to me. It's where I took my now wife on my early dates, and a pretty special place in my heart. So I think probably that glissading picture is one of my favorites.
Um, and little Kieran thought that the picture with the dark clouds on the river was fantastic. I'd have to agree. Naomi, age 8, wants to know what color ptarmigan you like the most.
Oh my gosh. When I encounter a ptarmigan in the winter, I'm always completely blown away at how white they are. And sometimes I have skied right past ptarmigan and didn't notice that they were there until they moved their head and their little black eyeball moved with their little black beak. And every year for the last number of years, I've been leading trips up to see polar bears in Churchill. And Joe, you were on one of those trips. And we always look for ptarmigan. And I've rarely been stumped. I've rarely missed one of those trips where I haven't seen ptarmigan. But one time we stopped in the vehicle when we were up polar bear watching, and in this small array of shrubbery, we saw a ptarmigan, just one. But then we saw another, and then another, and then another. We counted about 25, but they were so invisible because the ptarmigan were so white on the white snow. Ptarmigan are amazing. And Joe, the way they get through a bad day, if it's a very serious storm, they'll actually burrow in the snow and hide until the storm passes. And I've been skiing before, cross country skiing, and I've been in my own mind, in my own thoughts, just totally involved in the ski trip, and all of a sudden, bang, 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 the ptarmigans start to pop out of the snow. And I've nearly had a coronary because it's such a shock to have these feathered snowballs flying out from all around. It's amazing. They're amazing birds. I love ptarmigan.
Great. I'm going to I'll let you think for a second. I'm going to give everyone a tip in Edmonton. If you're in the Edmonton area and you want a great nature walk, the White Mud Creek Trail, I've taken Brian on it. It's a nature preserve. It's a nice trail to walk with your family. There's a gentleman down there that I've gotten to know over the last few years. He's photographed 130 species of birds along a 3-kilometer stretch of trail from winter to summer. It's amazing, and if you're lucky right now, there's a spot, there's this sign, you can't miss it. There's a nesting pair of great horned owls, and their 2 chicks are leaving the nest any day, so I would do that. The Edmonton hike is called the White Mud Creek. There's the north and south trails. One's off Fox Drive, and the other one is off the White Mud. You can easily find them on the map. And Brian, what's your favorite hike in the Calgary city, and then to get outside the city?
Oh my gosh, just this morning I walked from my house downstream to the Inglewood Bird Sanctuary. and following the Bow River the whole way. I was actually able to avoid some of the bike paths too, and just walked along the edge of the river. And the Inglewood Bird Sanctuary has been just a fantastic place to go and birdwatch over the last little while. There's a red-tailed hawk nesting on a big cell tower that is right beside the sanctuary, but in the sanctuary itself, last week we saw 2 pairs of wood ducks. Today we saw some golden eyes, and the male golden eye was showing off to the female doing its mating dance. They've got a couple of platforms with benches on them that you can sit. And a couple of days ago, I was sitting there watching, actually last week I was sitting there watching, and a loon came in. So, and I'm sure the loon was on its way up to your neck of the woods and further north, but to have a loon that close, it gave us a real chance to watch, and the water is crystal clear. And when the loon would dive under fishing for fish, we could actually watch it with our binoculars under the water and see its bizarre back feet doing its swimming as it was searching for fish. So the Inglewood Bird Sanctuary is a longtime favorite, and it's fantastic. And outside the city, a number of times I've been down to Frank Lake, and it's closed right now, but I believe it's going to open up when the provincial parks start to open up. Frank Lake is monitored by Ducks Unlimited. They've done an excellent job. It has an incredible array of nesting birds there, and they've got a bird blind that's set up so you can sit virtually meters away from ruddy ducks doing their thing. It's like some of the marsh areas that you've taken me to, Joe, up in Edmonton, but this is a very special place. Frank Lake is remarkable. It's got ibis there, and lots of terns nesting, and the proximity is fantastic.
Yeah, I've been to Frank Lake. It's amazing. It might be open now because I think the parks have opened, because I know Lois Hole Bird and the park opened here, so it should be open. We'll take one more. I can do one more question, then we'll call it a day. And I just saw it here. It's from Emily, age 10. And I believe Emily, if I'm not mistaken, is in northern BC. How do you know that the tracks were bear tracks?
Oh, well, the ones that were melted out up on the glacier, there was you could still see the bear claws. You could still see the pads of the feet and the way that, the typical bear pattern, the way that they were moving. And the other tracks that we saw were so fresh. You could see the pad of the bear. You could see the claws very clearly. Grizzly bear claws are very long compared to a black bear claw. So that's why we decided they were grizzly bears.
Great, we'll end it there. Thank you kindly, Brian, for your time today and doing this for us. Really appreciate it. Thank you again to Bonnie Drzowski and her family and my families for sponsoring this today for everyone. I think it was a big hit. Maybe if we're still stuck inside in a few months, we'll maybe do another Alberta talk with Brian and check in what he's doing. Maybe his ducks are back and they'll have nested. So or maybe we can do a live from his backyard. So thank you again, everyone. Enjoy your day. Get outside and enjoy nature. Take care. Stay safe.
Thanks so much, Joe.
Thank you, Brian.
You're welcome.